Hello everyone, I am a geek, an inventor, a cryptographer. Today I will talk about OPAQUE protocol. That is a password authenticated public key exchange protocol standardized by IETF RFC9807. In OPAQUE protocol, a client derives a private key during registration stage and retrieve this private key during authentication stage. So there are two stages: registration stage, authentication stage. In the registration stage, OPAQUE protocol standardize a mechanism to register the identity of the client. How to do it now? In OPAQUE protocol, it requires the client to derive a private key during registration stage, as opposed to store a private key during registration stage. What's the difference between derive and stores? If we say we want to derive a private key, it means that we have a seed, S-E-E-D, a seed, and we're using this seed to derive a private key. And when we say we store a private key, we mean we store the raw key of the private key in some storage. So OPAQUE protocol is a draft before it being standardized as RFC9807. Before the standardization, in draft 1 to 8, the OPAQUE protocol stores a specific private key on the server in registration stage. But after draft 9, the OPAQUE protocol requires a client to derive this key using a seed, and only the seed has been stored in the server. So in the finalized version of OPAQUE protocol, the client derives a seed during registration stage and store the seed in the server. And in authentication stage, the server sends the seed to the client, and the client retrieves this private key. Each time it needs to authenticate to the server. That is the basic idea of OPAQUE protocol. It uses an envelope to store the seed, and actually the seed does not being stored. What it has been stored is a string called nonce, N-O-N-C-E, a nonce. A nonce has been stored on the envelope. So the structure of envelope is a nonce and an OPAQUE. The structure of envelope designed by the OPAQUE has been minimalized with only two columns. The first column is a nonce. The second column is an OPAQUE, and the client can use this nonce to derive a seed, and using that seed to derive a private key, and using that private key to derive the public key. So the client retrieves a pair of private key and public key and authenticate to the server using this nonce. The OPRF function, oblivious pseudo-random function, OPRF function, ensures that only the correct password of the client can unlock the private key while avoiding the potential offline guessing attacks. So I will read to you now my note. We talk about the security consideration in OPAQUE protocol. So you just open the document RFC9807 in IETF document or OPAQUE protocol, and go through the section 10 security consideration. In OPAQUE, a client derives a private key as opposed to stores a private key during registration stage and retrieves this key each time it needs to authenticate to the server. The OPRF function, that is oblivious pseudo-random function, with the security property of the OPRF function, can be make sure, that is ensures, that only the correct password of the client can unlock the private key, while avoiding potential offline guessing attack. So, using OPRF function, the output of OPRF function is x to the y's power. I already talked about it. X to the y's power, which is a cross-stage key, which is a cross-stage secret key that is only known to the client. Only the client knows the cross-stage key, and the cross-stage key has been calculated by the client using element password X. So only client can use its password X to calculate a cross-stage key x to the y's power, which is cross-stage, that is across authentication and registration stages, and only the client knows the private key, the cross-stage key, and using this cross-stage key with the nonce, the client using nonce and cross-stage key to calculate a seed, and using that seed to derive a private key. So how to retrieve the credential? You open the section 6.3.2.3, retrieve credential. The client processes the message of the server and produce client's private key and the server's public key. Okay. Client retrieve client's own private key and the server's public key using retrieve credential function, defined in section 6.3.2.3. The concatenate of a server public key and envelope is equal to XO message. XO means a decryption function. So the server sent to the client a message, and the client using its cross-stage key, that is x to the y's power. In the OPAQUE, it is called a randomized password. The client uses the randomized password, which is a cross-stage password, to decrypt message using XO function. After its decryption, the output of the XO function is a concatenate of server public key and envelope, server public key and envelope. And the envelope, the structure of envelope is defined in section 4.1.1. The structure is a nonce and an auth stack. So the decryption of a message using XO function, which is being decrypted by using a randomized password, which is x to the y's power, which is a cross-stage key, which is across registration stage and authentication stage, which is only known by the client. Only the client knows the quarter stage key. And using that randomized password to decrypt the message, and the output is a concatenate of server public key, nonce, and all stack. Okay, now I talk about the envelope creation function in section 4.1.2 envelope creation function. We understand it that the make function, the input of a make function is concatenate of envelope nonce, server public key, length of the server identity plus server identity, length of the client identity, and the client identity. So this is the input to a make function. So we can see a weakness of OPAQUE protocol. There is a very specific weakness of OPAQUE protocol identified by me. I am Jimmy Yang. I specifically point out that there is a weakness in OPAQUE protocol 9807, where is the weakness? Because when we using a decryption function, there are three modes. There are three kinds of decryption. You can encrypt, and after encryption, you MAC the content. It means encrypt, then make. Or you can make your content and do encryption. That is make and encrypt. Make and then encrypt. And the third way of encryption is you can encrypt at the same time make the content. So make means a way to message authentication code to authenticate the message. So encryption and authentication should be done together. You can encrypt and then authenticate, or authenticate and then encrypt, or do encryption and authentication at the same time. But encryption without authentication is a failure. I will stress it again. Encryption without authentication is a failure. And you can see a weakness here, that the encryption of the message is to encrypt server public key, nonce, and all stack. But the make function is to make nonce, server public key, length, server identity, length, client identity, which is not the same. In the make function, the input is nonce and then server public key, and then length, and then server identity, and then length and the client identity. But the input of XOR function is server public key, nonce, or stack. So this is not identical. The input of encryption function, the server public key is before the nonce, but in the make function, the nonce is before the server public key. You see, in the encryption function, the input is that the server public key is precede to the nonce, but in the make function, the input is that the nonce is precede to the server public key. So the order is reversed. Either you using server public key before nonce, or using nonce before server public key, but you should not switch the order. So in my patent, my invention, I specifically use authentication code. I specifically use an authentication code, which is the V1, the first authentication code, and as an input to a make function. And I do not need to encrypt that V1. We do not need to send V1 to V2 in the encrypted form. But even if we want to send V1 to V2, even if we want to send V1 to the client, we will use an encrypted form of V1. The content of V1 shall not be, the order of the content of V1 shall not be changed. In the 6.3.2.3, the encryption function of the input is server common nonce common auth, but in the 4.1.2 envelope creation function, the input to a make function is envelope common server public key common length common server identity common length common client identity. So the content is not the same, and the order has been switched, which is not secure. So you should use a code as an input to a make function, and the content of the code shall be static, shall be identical to the information you send to the client. So in the OPAQUE, the server sends to the client a message after the decryption of a message by XO function. The client retrieves server public key, nonce, and auth take, but the order is not the same as the input to the envelope creation function. In the envelope creation function, the encoding is using client nonce plus server public key plus length of server identity plus server identity plus length of the client identity plus client identity, which is not the same as the input to the XO function used in 6.3.2.3 of the function of recover credential. So this is some weakness point of the OPAQUE protocol, and in my invention, in my patent, I specifically teach you a way to rescue this weakness and talk about using a first authentication code V1 to modify the OPAQUE protocol to rescue this weakness and make it more secure and more lightweight, because in my invention, we do not require to send V1, the first authentication code, to the client. But in the OPAQUE protocol, you need to send the message to the client, and the content of the message is server public key, nonce, and auth take. Why does the designer of the OPAQUE protocol need to send V1 to the client? Because the key point is that because the OPAQUE protocol uses the nonce as a way to derive the private key of the client. So the nonce shall be sent from the server to the client. But actually, the nonce is not necessary. The client can derive its own private key just using its client identity and randomize the password without relying on the nonce. But the inventor of OPAQUE protocol specifically require you to send the nonce from the server to the client, and the client shall recover the nonce in section 6.3.2.6 to retrieve this nonce and combine nonce and randomize the password to derive a seed and using that seed to derive a private key. But in my invention, I teach you another way, an alternative. You do not need to use nonce. You can just derive your private key using randomized password and your client identity. The nonce is not necessary. So the V1, first authentication code, does not need to be sent from the server to the client. And because my invention does not rely on the nonce, does not rely on sending the V1 to the client. So there is no client enumeration attack. In OPAQUE, there is a specific weakness of OPAQUE. Because the server sent the envelope to the client, so the attacker can use the information of the envelope to specifically attack the protocol using a way which is called client enumeration attack. That is, it can enumerate which client has registered its identity to the server from the envelope. Although attacker does not know the content of the envelope, but different envelope correspond to different identity of the client. So the attacker can use this information which is sent from the server to the client, which is the envelope, and using the information of envelope to gain something, gain what kind of a thing. It can distinguish whether a client has been registered, which identity has been registered to the server. That is client enumeration attack. So that is the weakness point of the OPAQUE protocol. Where is this weakness came from? It is because the OPAQUE protocol sent the envelope from the server to the client with a nonce. And using that nonce and randomize the password to derive a seed. And using that seed to derive a private key of the client. But it is not necessary. We do not need to use a nonce to derive a seed. The client identity plus randomized password is secure enough. Nonce is not necessary. But the OPAQUE protocol, the designer, forget about the client identity. So it does not use client identity as an input to the function to create the seed. So in the OPAQUE protocol, the OPRF function does not require client identity as an input to the OPRF function. But in my design, in my invention, I talk about using client identity as an input to derive the client private key. So if we use client identity and randomize the password both as inputs to a function to derive a client private key, then that is enough to be secure to derive the private key. We do not need to rely on nonce. But the OPAQUE protocol wrap the nonce inside the envelope and send the nonce to the client, which at the first look as if it is more secure. But there is a weakness, that is the client enumeration attack. So that is the details of the difference between OPAQUE protocol and my invention. So do you understand it now? Thank you very much. Bye-bye.